unless there's some changes in the way we live on this planet, it's not going to make all that much difference. So I think if your audience has any enthusiasm or energy to do something about this, it's going to be through their political representatives and what they can do to legislate or pass policies that are going to be protecting the environment. So this is going to be around fossil fuels, coal, and electric cars, and alternate sources of energy. All these things I think are going to be important, and I think individual action in a policy sense is going to be the most important thing.
Hello and welcome to Cure Talks. This is Priya Menon, your host. Today on Cure Talks, we are discussing the impact of climate change on cancer and cancer control. We have with us Dr. Robert Hyatt from the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Hyatt is Professor, Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and the Associate Director of Population Sciences of the UCSF Comprehensive Cancer Center. Joining Dr. Hyatt on the panel today is melanoma survivor, author, advocate, and teacher David Stanley. Welcome to Cure Talks, everyone. Climate change affects more than weather patterns or the environment. It also has a substantial impact on human health. Its contribution to the cancer burden includes increased levels of carcinogens, comorbidity factors, cancer incidence, and reduced access to care. Dr. Hyatt, can you just summarize, and talk a little bit about how climate change affects cancer?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you for having me on this program. I'm happy to participate. Well, this is an interesting question, isn't it? Because cancer is a disease which occurs over a long period of time. You don't get cancer one day and get diagnosed the next. So it has a long latent period from many different causes. And so the study and the relationship of climate change to cancer is evolving, and we're still observing its potential effects. But when I was asked to write this review, we thought my co-author and I, Naomi Bilar, who's a climate change expert, got together to just consider all the possible ways that climate change could affect cancer. And basically, as we describe in our paper, the effects of climate change are going to be on things that people pretty much understand now: extreme weather, heat, sea rise, unpredictable weather changes, and things like wildfires. So there's going to be a lot of things that happen in the environment. Only more recently, however, have people started thinking about the effects on health. And the most obvious things are going to be the effects on infectious diseases or acute diseases that happen right away. So the change of vectors of infectious disease can be influenced by temperature. And the other effect is likely to be something on mental health. There's going to be a lot of changes that put stress on individuals and populations, which could have impacts that way. But for cancer, we had to think about a longer term perspective. And basically, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about this, the kinds of things that are liable to affect cancer are going to be the changes in air, water, and food quality and access. So air pollution of various substances, sun exposure, food availability and quality, and water access and its purity. So those are the big categories. And what we did was go into more detail for each one of them.
Yeah. Interestingly, Dr. Hyatt, we were just brainstorming this talk within our team, and my colleague was mentioning how he moved into a neighborhood near the airport. And during apparently, the first get together, he noticed that every house had a cancer story. Is this something that is related, to climate change or pollution, aviation fuel in the air? Because yeah.
Well, so interesting. Couple things come to mind when you tell me that story.
Yeah.
It is true that people who live near highways and airports are more exposed to, fuel exhaust, fossil fuels, and that's where you get something called particulate matter 2.5, PM 2.5.
Yeah.
It's a very small particle that gets into the deep part of the lungs and carries with it carcinogens. So there is evidence that exposure to air pollution is associated with higher levels of certain types of upper respiratory cancers. And it's also known that the air pollution occurs in places around highways and airports. However, climate change may have actually reduced the amount of air flights. So, this is a sort of thing that we need to look at over a long period of time to really assess. And the other thing is, your audience should know that this phenomena which you describe is called cancer clusters, where people notice cancers occurring in higher rate, or that seems to be occurring at higher levels in certain communities and certain exposures. When those kinds of clusters are examined, very rarely do they turn up with any clear relationship to a carcinogen exposure. It's usually more to do with how people who have cancer start talking about it with their neighbors and other people in their social circle, and things come out of the woodwork. Oh yes, my aunt Josie had cancer. So it's a reporting phenomena that has to be worked out. Scientists are very familiar with these cluster evaluations and need to sort out what's really due to a real exposure and what's due to a perception change.
Thank you, Dr. Hyatt. Circling back to our climate change and cancer impact, how do scientists actually study these impacts? Because as you said, it takes like a long time to manifest and present. So how are these studies conducted?
Yes.
Isn't that one of the challenges that you must be facing?
Absolutely. This is a very crucial point. Normally, we study things by looking at an exposure and an outcome. So we try to understand if it's associated, and if it is associated, is it causal? So in order to do that, epidemiologists and other scientists have developed methods where we have comparison groups. So we compare what happens to somebody who's exposed to somebody who isn't, and we look for differences in outcomes. It's very hard to do that for climate change because everybody's exposed. So what's your control group? And even if you think, well, we can compare one population in the United States to another population in the United States, or maybe to Canada, or maybe to South Africa, you have problems with, are they really comparable? I mean, there's so many other issues. So long story short, it's very difficult to use traditional methods of establishing cause for climate change since the exposure is so ubiquitous. The way to study it, I believe, is through longitudinal studies that collect information on exposures and people's health and follow them over long periods of time. So you can tell from longitudinal studies that are sometimes called prospective studies, the relationship of characterizations that you make at the baseline of a study like that with what happens over time. Now, it might take 10 years or 20 years to get the full benefit of these kinds of studies, But if I were the person holding the money bags to do these kind of studies, that's what I would emphasize: longitudinal, detailed studies to track health outcomes related to different types of exposures.
What are some of the primary cancers that would be directly affected by climate change?
Well, the first thing you need to look at is lung cancer, I believe. Lung cancer and other upper respiratory cancers. You also need to track skin cancers.
Yes.
And I look forward to talking to Mr. Stanley about that, given his own personal experience.
Yes.
I think also you need to look at gastrointestinal cancers, things that are related to nutrition, so stomach, colon, rectal cancers, because they're going to be harder to attribute to changes in climate through changes in nutrition, but still that's a viable pathway. I think those are the main categories that are likely to change.
Dr. Hyde, your review also talks about weather disasters delaying cancer treatment. It'd be great if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think in terms of what's going to happen first with climate change, it's more likely to be something related to the way we take care of cancer patients and health. Let's call it healthcare or cancer care services. So most people know or can appreciate that cancer is a very complex group of diseases. There's usually not one type of doctor that takes care of it. There are medical oncologists and radiation oncologists and surgical oncologists and surgical nurses and a complex support system.
Mm-hmm.
The drugs are complex. Pharmacy is involved. The supply line for therapeutics is complicated. And then radiation oncology uses very complex equipment that needs to be maintained and supplied. So because of the complexity, there are many different places in the cancer care delivery process that can be adversely impacted by weather changes or disrupted by supply chain issues. And you just look around the world these days and you can see lots of evidence of what has happened with the pandemic, with the recession and supply chain issues, with the war in the Ukraine. These things reveal the sort of vulnerabilities that the world has in terms of interacting and supporting all sorts of issues, including medical care. So I predict, if I need to predict anything, that the first things you're going to notice are going to be disruptions in the diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up of cancer patients because of problems with supply chain and weather. There's a couple stories in my review where I talk about what happened in New Orleans with the Katrina storm, where there were disruptions in sea level rise that causes flooding and environmental contamination of water. There's examples of weather changes in California with wildfires, where there's been contamination of the air with chemicals that cause cancer. So there's direct possible interruption of the normal processes that we depend upon for the diagnosis and care of cancer.
Thank you, Dr. Hyde. I'm going to get David into the discussion now. David, before you ask your questions, I was particularly, it struck me when Dr. Hyde said the vulnerability, right? So when you were diagnosed, right, David, I think quite a few years back, what was your thought process then? Because being diagnosed with melanoma has a direct connection to being exposed. Right. So what did you think at that time? I know now you're very knowledgeable, but at that
Much
time,
better, yeah.
yes.
I'm a much better patient than I was back then. I was diagnosed, I think it was 2005, 2006. And of course, at that stage, there really was nothing besides cut it out. A little bit of interferon to a certain extent, but in the last 10 years or so, we've seen these massive changes in all kinds of these monoclonal antibodies that people are working with. And it's really increased, of course, the survival rate of melanoma. But at the same time, due to a lot of climatic changes, we're seeing massive increases in new cases. I was looking these up earlier this morning because I wanted to be well informed when we talked to Dr. Hyatt. We're looking at 1.34 million new cases of a variety of skin cancers for 2022. In 2018, we saw about 56,000 new cases of melanoma. The prediction for 2022 is nearly 100,000. 3-4 years later, and we're looking at 60,000 to 100,000 cases. That's a huge leap. And it's not difficult to connect the dots in terms of climate change, UV radiation exposure, and what we're seeing in terms of all these skin cancer issues. Now, in my particular case, it was easy because I spent 10 years of my life as a semi-professional bicycle racer. I was on a bike 20 to 30 hours a day in sunny conditions. I was in my 20s, so of course I was 10 foot tall and bulletproof. A tan was a great thing because it meant you were spending all of your time out on the bike, you were training. And so I ended up with stage 2, nearly stage 3 melanoma. It was, as my doc said, if you had waited 6 months to a year, we'd be having very different conversations about your treatment options. And so first question for you, Dr. Hyatt, is that, is my logic correct here that over the last 10 years or so, these accelerations in skin cancer changes really are due to climatic changes that we're dealing with that are making us far more vulnerable to the ultraviolet radiation that's responsible for so much of the skin cancers that we're seeing?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. It is well known that skin cancers, all 3 major types, melanoma, basal cell carcinoma, and squamous cell carcinoma, are sensitive to ultraviolet radiation and damage to the skin that results from that. Melanoma, which is the cancer that you had, is the one that can be fatal and has been fatal for many people over the years. You're correct, it's now more easily treated with advanced types of medication, but the incidence, the number of new cases is going up dramatically. It's one of the cancers, along with thyroid and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and liver, that is increasing. Most cancers are decreasing in terms of their frequency and death rates, but melanoma is going up. Now, it like the other types of skin cancer is sensitive to ultraviolet radiation and directly to human behavior in being outside in the sun. We've known that for a long time. What's different now is worrying about what the effect of climate change is going to be on the exposure to ultraviolet radiation. So the only nuance on what you described that I would offer is that it used to be thought that the problem was the destruction of the ozone layer. You remember the concern about the refrigerants getting into the atmosphere and destroying the ozone layer. Well, this was true. Those chemicals did reduce the ozone layer and made the exposure to ultraviolet radiation more likely and easier, especially in certain parts of the world where the ozone layer was thinner. But there was an international effort to rectify that, and it resulted in something called the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which effectively reversed the use of all these fluorocarbons that are in refrigerants, and has resulted in a closure of these holes in the ozone layer that we're all very happy to see. So I would have to say parenthetically, there's one example of international cooperation around climate change, at least. So what happens now is it's basically around human behavior. So when it gets hot, people can be motivated to get outside, cool off, do something where they can take off their shirt or, strip down a bit and enjoy getting a tan or whatever. That's bad. That's going to lead to more ultraviolet light exposure and cancers, especially worrisome as the melanoma cancer. So it's not so much that there's more ultraviolet light or ultraviolet radiation, it's more that human behaviors, I think most of the literature supports that human behaviors are likely to change with increased temperatures that can lead to more cancers.
In some of the reading I was doing as well, I was noting a big increase in colorectal cancers, especially among Gen Xers and millennials. And typically, that's not an age group that colorectal cancers affect. Normally the numbers we see for that kind of skew, at least the data I saw, skews a little bit higher. People into their 50s and above, not the younger people. If that's true, and correct me if I'm wrong, with this rise in colorectal cancers, what can we attribute that? Is there anything going on in terms of climate change that might have an effect on colorectal cancer rates increasing?
What you state again is absolutely correct. That there has been an increase in number of new cases in individuals less than 50, and screening recommendations start at 50. So people younger than the normal age of screening are starting to get cancer, and that's been a worldwide observation. Mainly, I would say in Anglo countries like Canada and New Zealand and Australia, England, but we don't know the reason for it. It has resulted in a change in the recommendations to start colorectal cancer screening to 45, at 45. It used to be 50. So that's one reaction, policy reaction of the medical world to that observation. Colorectal cancer in older people is actually going down because of screening. So you got this weird crossover where colorectal cancer incidence, new cases, and mortality are decreasing overall, but the young folks are getting more of it. I have a cousin whose daughter just got it at age 35. Wow. So it's pretty dramatic, and the reason for it is unknown. If you look it up in authoritative sources, the speculation is just that. It's speculation around the use of antibiotics and perhaps changing what's called the microbiome, and changes in the inflammatory environment in the gut, perhaps changes in environmental chemicals in food, but it's all hypotheses at this point. We really don't know the cause.
Well, let me throw this out there because it's something that I've been thinking about. Growing up here in Michigan and attending Michigan State, which is a big ag school, you have a fair amount of attention put on agricultural practices, even if you're not a farmer. I grew up in the suburbs. My dad was a proctologist, but still 5 years at Michigan State. And I think about where our food comes from. And we know that small farmers, who many of them are better stewards of the land because of economies of scale, are being squeezed out. And we also know that the agribusiness is not noted for being good stewards of the land and the best farming practices. And is it a possibility that because of the way our food is now being processed, and this is an age group that is extremely busy, they're being squeezed at both ends by aging parents that they're having to take care of, by children they're having to take care of. Is it possible then that these highly processed foods that the agribusinesses contribute to is playing a role in these increased colorectal cancers?
Well, interestingly, I grew up in Michigan too,
Oh,
but downstate in Ann Arbor.
yeah, it's a nice town, Ann Arbor. I like it.
We don't have to go into that.
Right.
But I think you have a point there. This should be an area for study. I think there's all sorts of reasons why agribusiness is not good for our food supply and for the environment. Diversity is pretty clearly preferable to monocultures, no matter where you are, whether it's a palm forest in Liberia or a farm in Brazil or a wheat field in Iowa. It's more productive for the short term, but it has deleterious effects on overall ecology. That was known before we started worrying about climate change. Climate change is likely to take advantage of the, and this is speculative, take advantage of the vulnerabilities produced by these large monocultures in agriculture in ways that we don't know yet. But I think you raise a very good point. And I think the French farmers in Provence have been arguing that for a while as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk, if we can, about diet for a second, because of course, when things get tough, in terms of the economy and our health and whatever, the charlatans come out of the woodwork. That you take this or you eat that, and you're going to be, the cancer diet. Is there, to your knowledge, any tenable research about, aside from high fiber, low in saturated fats, eat your fruits and veg, is there any kind of diet that you're aware of that shows any kind of protection in general in terms of promoting better health and protection against cancer?
I talk a little bit about this in my review, and the short answer is yes. And I think the things that we know that can be protective against developing cancers are diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables, low in red and processed meats, and diets which help you avoid being overweight or obese. One thing that's happened with cancer research and epidemiology in the last 20 years has been the clear relationship between obesity and cancer, probably through some inflammatory pathway. But half of individuals less than 40 or 50 in the United States are overweight, and about 17% are obese. So there you have, one of the possible relation or causal factors related to increased colorectal cancer in young people. But it's true in general that obesity can be related to about 17 different cancers. So if people are looking for a way to prevent cancer through diet, eat your fruits and vegetables, modest amounts of red meat and processed meat, and avoid becoming overweight as much as you can. And that's going to relate to physical activity too, but it's right there with it.
Yeah. Let me change the subject just a skosh here in the West anyway. I'm not so sure how popular electric vehicles are in other parts of the world, but here in the Europe and America, big push obviously for electric vehicles, but we're only seeing about 20 to 21% of our current electrical power is from green sources. So that means 75-80% of the electricity that's being generated to run these cars that aren't burning fossil fuels is probably coming from some sort of fossil fuel, whether it's coal or whatever. Do you see that, I don't want to say hypocrisy, do you see that, but do you see those two bumping up against each other in any particular way in terms of climate change and how that might lead to some sort of effect on our health?
Good question. I think the way to think about it is we're in a transition period. I think that 17% or 21% that you mentioned is a point in time, but I think the use of electric vehicles is increasing rapidly. And just last week, we finally got I guess, almost have a bill that will help support the use of electric vehicles as part of the climate change legislation, which is a great thing. I think that change needs to occur at the policy level, but I think individuals should not be inhibited to, this is personal feeling, I'm not sure I got the data for it, but I don't think individuals should be discouraged from purchasing an electric vehicle if they can, because of some fear of actually using more coal. I think there's going to be increasing turn toward non-fossil fuel sources of energy in the next decade, I think we're just looking at things now in at a point in time and not a conflict. I mean, you can any different slice you want to take of our experience can make you ask the question, which you did. But I think if you take a long review and realize how rapidly things are changing, that you can be fairly optimistic.
And this more back to your back to the review article, which I read. Actually, I've read 3 times now because it's pretty interesting stuff. And uh, we're seeing massive melt-offs in glaciers. We're seeing, ice shelves of being destroyed at ever increasing rates, and obviously with lots of bad results here. But people tend to focus on things like rising water levels. But my concern is over the last 15,000 years, a whole lot of stuff has settled into that ice. And as that ice melts, are we going to see an increase in carcinogens that have been held in either solution or frozen in that ice, released into the atmosphere? And what kind of outcome are we looking at besides just the obvious, Miami Beach is going to be underwater here in another 5 years?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that people are concerned about, and it does affect food production in the sense that it decreases the amount of arable land in some places, especially the island populations. But the point you're talking about is really interesting. We found one example. So you can't really measure increased pollution in the oceans. It's a drop in the bucket type of problem. But if you think about glaciers and Switzerland, or European sources of water from glaciers, there you can capture the runoff. And there have been investigators in Europe who have looked at contamination in water that's come from glaciers and found carcinogens in them, just as you point out. So I think, although there's not a lot of literature supporting that and confirming it, I think it certainly supports the idea that it can be a problem. And so I think that's another area that people are going to want to look at more closely over time.
One last question then, and moving back to melanoma. Aside from the things that we're already doing, wearing our hats, UPF clothing and SPF, on exposed skins, is there anything that, in terms of climate change and increased rates of melanoma, is there any sort of warning, any kind of takeaway that I can take to like the people who follow my page on Facebook about melanoma? Is there anything I can take to them that they can help protect themselves as over the next 10, 15, 20 years, as we continue to see melanoma rates rise as climate change affects our world?
I think you probably covered it, to be perfectly honest. I think David, there's the things that people need to do to protect themselves against getting melanoma are all the things that you mentioned, and I'll throw in obesity and overweight. So that doesn't change. The thing that changes with climate change is that it's likely to be more intense. All these things become more important. So I think if you continue making those kind of recommendations and point out to people that this is going to be increasingly important over time, that you're on sound basis, sound ground.
All right, Priya.
Thanks, David. Thank you.
And by the way, Dr. Hyatt, really interesting to talk to you, because I think you've hit on an area that has not been addressed in terms of either climate change, the effects, or increasing rates of cancer. And the way you brought those two together, I think it's, if we're not hearing the call now, we're not ever going to hear it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And the great questions you had there. Dr. Hyatt, before we wrap up, just one last question. You did, in your review, you also talk about methods to mitigate the effects of climate change. I know you talked about food and diet, what we need to eat or follow, and you talked about melanoma. I mean, David almost covered it. Is there anything else to add to this?
Well, you're giving me a chance to talk about the importance of policy change, I think. I mean, all these things, we've talked about what you can do as an individual, but unless there's some changes in the way we live on this planet, it's not going to make all that much difference. So I think if your audience has any enthusiasm or energy to do something about this, it's going to be through their political representatives and what they can do to legislate or pass policies that are going to be protecting the environment. So this is going to be around fossil fuels, coal, and electric cars, and alternate sources of energy. All these things I think are going to be important, and I think individual action in a policy sense is going to be the most important thing.
Thank you, Dr. Hyatt. That was a very informative session. And David, as always, you have some great questions. The reason I, pull you into these talks. So thanks for them. We also thank
Always
you.
A pleasure.
We also thank UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. This talk will be available on curetalks.com. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.